Réchicourt-la-Petite, Lorraine, northeastern France, 8:15, September 19th, 1944. A wall of fog sits low over the wheat stubble, thick enough that a man standing at one end of a field cannot see the hedgerow at the other. Corporal Ellis Simmons crouches in the open turret hatch of an M18 Hellcat, engine idling, and listens. Somewhere out there in the gray, tracks are grinding over gravel. He cannot see them. He can hear them. A gunner beside him whispers the range estimate off the sound alone, because the alternative is waiting to see the enemy first, and by then it will already be too late. The Hellcat's 76mm gun sits loaded. Nobody speaks above a murmur. Then, no more than 60 yards ahead, a shape resolves out of the white, the long overhanging gun barrel and sloped glacis plate of a German Panther, moving at walking pace, its own commander apparently just as blind as the Americans. Simmons's driver does not wait for orders. He guns the engine, swings the lightly armored tank destroyer hard right, and the gunner puts the first round into the Panther's flank before its crew has even registered where the shot came from. That single ambush, repeated in variation across a scattering of small fields and sunken lanes that morning, was part of one of the most lopsided armored engagements fought by American troops in the whole of the Second World War. It did not happen because the M18 Hellcat was a better tank than the Panther. On paper, it was not close. It happened because of fog, tactics, and a handful of tank destroyer crews from the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion who understood exactly how to use both. To understand why this mattered, one has to go back a few days. By mid-September 1944, General George S. Patton's Third Army had driven roughly 400 miles across France in under 3 months, outrunning its own fuel supply lines in the process. Patton's spearhead, the 4th Armored Division, had pushed into the Lorraine region and taken the small town of Arracourt on the 16th of September, threatening to open a route towards the Saar industrial basin and beyond it, Germany itself. Adolf Hitler, alarmed at the collapse of the front, ordered a counterattack using 2 newly formed panzer brigades, the 111th and the 113th, hastily assembled units built around the Panther OSF. G, arguably the most formidable medium tank fielded by any nation in the war. The Panther carried a long-barreled 75mm KWK 42 gun capable of killing an American Sherman at well over 1,000 yards, and sloped frontal armor roughly 80 millimeters thick that most Allied tank guns struggled to penetrate head-on. Against it, Patton had Shermans and, crucially, the M18 Hellcat, a tank destroyer built by Buick on a stripped-down chassis, armed with a 76mm gun, protected by armor barely 12.7 millimeters thick at its heaviest point, and capable of a genuinely startling 55 miles per hour on a road. It was designed on one doctrine only: shoot and scoot. It was never meant to slug it out face-to-face with a Panther. It was meant to get a shot into the side or rear, then disappear before the return fire arrived. On the morning of September 19th, roughly 262 tanks and assault guns of Panzer Brigade 113, commanded by Colonel Erdmann, moved forward from the east towards Arracourt, intending to retake the town and cut off the American spearhead. What the German planners had not accounted for was the weather. A dense ground fog, common in that part of Lorraine in autumn, rolled across the rolling farmland around Réchicourt-la-Petite and reduced visibility in places to under 100 yards. For a tank like the Panther, built to dominate at long range, fog was close to a fatal handicap. For the Americans, dug into hedgerows and orchards with orders to hold their ground rather than maneuver in the open, it offered something close to the opposite: a chance to fight the war at 50 yards instead of 1,000. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, attached to the 4th Armored Division, had a platoon of 5 M18 Hellcats positioned near Réchicourt under the command of 2nd Lieutenant Edwin Leiper. As the German column advanced blind through the mist, Leiper's crews held their fire, waited for engine noise and shapes to confirm range, and then fired from angles the Panther's crews never saw coming. A Panther's armor, so formidable from the front, was noticeably thinner on the sides and rear, in places barely 40 to 45 millimeters, well within range of a 76mm shell fired at close quarters. Over a period of intense close-range fighting that morning, Leiper's small platoon accounted for a striking run of kills against the German column advancing past their position, tank after tank going up in flame within a matter of minutes as the fog briefly parted and closed again around each engagement. Crews reloaded, repositioned a few dozen yards, and fired again before the surviving Panthers could properly identify where the fire was coming from. Elsewhere across the Arracourt sector that same morning, other American units were fighting their own versions of the same battle. Near the village of Besange-la-Petite, Sherman tanks of the 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams engaged Panthers at ranges under 300 yards, close enough to partially offset the German gun advantage. Artillery observers from the 191st Field Artillery Battalion, unable to see targets directly through the fog, walked fire onto German columns using sound alone, a technique normally reserved for night fighting. Fighter bombers of the U.S. 9th Air Force, grounded that morning by the same weather protecting the tank destroyer crews on the ground, would not be able to join the fight until visibility improved past midday, when P-47 Thunderbolts finally rose from airfields around Tull and Nancy to hunt the remnants of the German column in the open. If you are enjoying this deep dive into one of the lesser-known tank battles of the Western Front, a quick subscribe helps more than you might think and costs nothing. By early afternoon, the fog had begun to lift, and what had been a battle fought blind became one fought in the open, with consequences that cut both ways. German tanks that had survived the morning ambushes now found themselves visible to American artillery observers on higher ground around Arracourt itself, while surviving Panzer Brigade 113 elements, disorganized and lacking coordinated command after losing several company commanders in the morning fighting, struggled to regroup. Colonel Erdmann's brigade had entered the day with roughly 90 tanks fit for action. By nightfall, after a day of fighting across the wider Arracourt sector, Panzer Brigade 113 had lost somewhere in the region of 25 to 30 tanks destroyed or abandoned, a devastating rate of attrition for a single day's fighting. American losses across the same sector were a fraction of that, though not negligible. Several Shermans and at least one Hellcat were lost to Panther fire. Once ranges opened up in the afternoon and the German guns' advantage reasserted itself. The fighting did not end with the 19th. Renewed German attacks, including a fresh push by Panzer Brigade 111 under Colonel Bayer on September 22nd, kept the Arracourt sector contested for close to a further week, with American forces holding the ground despite being consistently outgunned tank for tank. What became clear to American commanders over those days was not that the Sherman or the Hellcat could outfight a Panther gun for gun. They could not, and everyone from Patton downward knew it. What became clear was that terrain, weather, ambush discipline, and combined use of tank destroyers, artillery, and air power could offset a German qualitative advantage that, fought purely as a straight tank duel at long range in open ground, the Americans would have lost badly. Orders issued after Arracourt reinforced existing doctrine that Hellcat crews were to avoid frontal engagements wherever possible, and instead use speed and concealment to secure flank or rear shots, precisely the tactic that had worked so effectively in the fog around Arracourt. By the close of the Arracourt battles, which ran intermittently from the 18th to the 29th of September 1944, German forces in the sector had lost somewhere in the region of 86 tanks and assault guns, against American losses generally estimated at under 40 tanks and tank destroyers combined, a ratio that startled even Patton's own staff, given how heavily the Panther outgunned and outarmored its American opponents on paper. It stands as one of the largest tank battles fought by United States forces in the European theater, smaller in scale than the later fighting in the Ardennes that winter, but proportionally one of the more lopsided American victories of the entire campaign in the West. Historians studying the battle afterwards, including officers compiling after-action reports for the U.S. Army's official history program, pointed repeatedly to two factors above all others: the fog on the morning of the 19th, and the discipline of tank destroyer crews who held their fire and let range close before shooting, rather than opening up early and giving away their position for a shot unlikely to penetrate. Arracourt did not decide the war. The German counteroffensive at Lorraine failed to retake meaningful ground. Patton's Third Army held its positions, and within weeks the front had stabilized into the grinding autumn campaign that would eventually give way to the Battle of the Bulge that December, a battle in which Panthers would again prove lethal against American armor, this time without the fog to level the field. But for the crews of the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, Arracourt was proof that a Hellcat, lightly armored and outgunned as it was on specification sheets, could still win, provided it fought on its own terms rather than the enemy's. Back at Arracourt-le-Petit, as the mist finally burns off under the midday sun,
Corporal Ellis Simmons climbs down from his Hellcat to inspect the field his platoon fought across only hours earlier. Blackened Panthers sit at odd angles among the hedgerows, some still smouldering, their long guns pointed uselessly at targets they never saw. His own tank carries not a single scratch. He did not win because his gun was better or his armour thicker. He won because he waited for the fog to bring the enemy close enough that none of that mattered anymore, and then he did not miss